All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to Passion Talk. So this talk is motivated by something that previous speakers have alluded to. That is, how can I reconcile my intellect with my belief in God? Can I be authentic to my intellectual pursuit, or do I have to compartmentalize? Here is religion. Here is my academic studies. Now, these questions are really beyond the scope of this talk. But I would like to take a step back and address a more fundamental question. That is, what is rationality? What makes a belief rational? Now, there are two ways we can think about rationality. One is that people are trying to seek the truth. People start with some hypotheses, and they look at evidence, and then they form a posterior. One way to capture this process is Bayesian updating. Now, another way we could think about rationality is that people are trying to maximize their utility. So, for example, I might believe that I'm the smartest person in the world, which is obviously inaccurate. But this belief could give me more self-esteem and could possibly motivate me to work harder and achieve my goals. So, in this talk, I'm just going to address this one point. That is, beliefs are often motivated. Many of our beliefs are biased. But these biases aren't random. They often serve a functional purpose. So to set the stage, let me introduce this term called confirmation bias. This is the idea that if you believe something is true, you're more likely to find evidence to justify your position. And this behavior shows up in three ways. One is biased selection of evidence. Two, biased interpretation of evidence. And three, biased memory. Let's talk about biased selection. People often avoid information that they dislike. So, for example, individuals who get STD tests often, try to avoid knowing their results. And managers sometimes avoid hearing arguments that conflict with their preliminary decisions, even though those decisions could be ill-founded. And in lab experiments, some people not only avoid knowing their IQ score, but they're actually willing to pay money to avoid their IQ score. So now, in addition to this information avoidance, people also discount information from sources they dislike. So in particular, people could be exposed to different sources of information, but they put more weights on the ones that they agree with. So for example, conservatives often put more weights on Fox News, and liberals often put more weights on the National Public Radio. And on the internet, people do read a broad spectrum of news sources. However, people are still very polarized because they put different weights on different sources. Now, one thing you might say is that if that were true, then why don't we just have a centralized information system and then, let everyone be exposed to all sides of the same issue? But the issue here is more subtle. Experiments by Stanford psychologists have shown that if you got two groups of people reading the same information, they could come out very differently. So they got a group of students who support capital punishment and a group of students who oppose capital punishment. And then they show them information, the same information, which are studies on whether capital punishment actually deters crimes. And then they survey people's beliefs afterward. What they find is that rather than converging, the people actually diverge, which means that people who have different beliefs, they interpret different information differently, and they use the different information to justify their original positions. And these polarization experiments have been replicated for many other controversial issues, such as nuclear deterrence or climate change. So why is this polarization different from, say, Bayesian updating or these truth-seeking models? The difference is that if you're a Bayesian, then you should start with some probability, and then you want to evaluate your hypothesis given the evidence. And this conditional probability should be independent of one's prior. But what these polarization experiments have shown is that the way people interpret information actually depends on the prior they have. Some possible explanations include, maybe people are local thinkers. They can only understand their own position and can't really think much about the other side. Or maybe people might be misinterpreting information that contradicts their original position. And then another explanation that I find quite powerful is this can I versus must I difference. When I think about my own belief, I'm asking, can I believe the things I believe in? But when I think about the other side, I'm asking, must I believe the other side? You see, the bar for must I believe is much higher. So to recap where we are, we started off with these two approaches to rationality. First is that people are Bayesian. They seek the truth. They look at evidence, and they are unbiased in their interpretation. But this seems to be inconsistent with these observed patterns of confirmation bias. So the natural question to ask is, are these biases just exogenous? Are they random? Or are they actually intrinsic? Perhaps they are motivated because they serve a certain purpose. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate this point. The example is about people's belief on social mobility and redistribution. The central question that we ask here is, should government redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor? Initially, you might think that people whose income is above the average should oppose redistribution, and people whose income is below average should support redistribution. However, there is another component that is social mobility. Suppose I'm poor, but I believe that if I work hard, I can get to the top. Then I have less incentive to support redistribution. And in fact, this graph shows that this graph plots different countries, and they ask people, how optimistic are you about social mobility? And then on the y-axis is, how much that country spends on welfare. And essentially, that's upward sloping shows that, countries in which people believe that there is a lot of social mobility tend to spend less on social welfare. And as you see, for example, United States is on the left, and then Denmark is on the right. In Europe, people tend to attribute success to luck rather than hard work. Now, what about the actual data on social mobility? It turns out that the United States is actually behind the UK, Denmark, and Canada in terms of social mobility, where the social mobility here is defined as the probability that a child born in the bottom fifth is going to end up in the top fifth. And as you see that in the United States, that probability is only 7.5%, whereas in Canada, it's almost twice as much. However, we also see that in the United States, people are very optimistic about social mobility than in these other countries. So this seems like a puzzle. And economist Bond van Tirol proposed this model of motivated belief to resolve this puzzle. The idea is that belief about social mobility is going to influence my investment in education and hard work. And in the United States, parents tend to instill in their children certain values, such as the American dream and the Protestant work ethic. And these values motivate the children to work hard and be optimistic about their opportunities. So the key driver here is that beliefs could be inaccurate. They're not backed up by data. However, they do serve a functional purpose. And that is the key takeaway from this talk. So now I want to talk a bit about religion. The key question is, are religious beliefs biased? Well, this question is a tough one, because who gets to define what biased is? However, there are some ways in which we could think about this question. There are, for example, the Baylor Religion Survey and some of the other surveys, they ask Americans about their beliefs in God, their beliefs on Scripture, their beliefs on other aspects of their religion. And the main takeaway is that if you ask 100 Americans who God is, you get 200 different answers. And let me just give you one example. When they ask people, do you think a good person of another religion can go to heaven? And most Americans actually say yes. The Mormons in particular, 98% of them say yes. The mainline, 96%. And even you go down to the evangelical Christians, the 83% of them would think that a good person with a different religion could go to heaven. So this simple example already illustrates that people's beliefs often differ from what their congregation is teaching them. And the Baylor Religion Survey asks all sorts of questions like this, and they find that basically people's beliefs are all over the place. Now, the next question is whether religion is utility maximizing. Do they serve a functional purpose? That's also a tough question, because how do I know people's utility over their religious beliefs? However, there are some studies which try to, they demonstrate the effect of church attendance on individual outcomes, such as their economic outcome and health outcome. So the first two papers here are published in the Journal of American Medical Association. They studied the effect of religious service on suicide and the effect of church attendance on mortality. And one key takeaway from this is that, yes, church attendance indeed reduces the suicide rate and reduces mortality. And on average, going to church makes someone live 7 years longer. Now, you could say that's just a correlation, but that's still a very interesting correlation to consider. Right? And the other two papers, one is in the Journal of Political Economy, the other one is in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and they study the effect of religion on depression in adolescents. And the second paper study the effect of religion on drunk driving and drug use. And they all find positive effects. Right? So these are just some examples in which shows that even if we think about religion in terms of its functional purpose, it does seem to have some positive impact. Yeah. And to conclude, I have shown you that there are two approaches to rationality. One is that people seek the truth. Particularly, we can model people's beliefs in terms of Bayesian updating. And we have shown that that is quite inconsistent with many of the ways in which we actually update our beliefs. But then another way is utility maximization. That is, we simply want to use our beliefs to achieve certain goals. And in economics, there is this theorem which says an expected utility maximizer should always want to know the truth. Expected utility maximizer always wants more accurate information. But in reality, we also know that people aren't really expected utility maximizers. So we say beliefs are often motivated. They're biased, but they are not random. These biases, they could be inaccurate, but they do serve a functional purpose. Thank you.